The American continent often appears in people's minds as a young land when compared to Europe's stone castles, Egypt's pyramids, or Mesopotamia's clay tablets. It feels as if its past is limited to just a few centuries. Yet the truth is entirely different, because North and South America have been inhabited by humans for at least 15, perhaps 20,000 years, forming a vast stage where countless cultures were born, flourished, and vanished. And still, strangely, this stage remains in the background of global history. When America is mentioned, most people think only of the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas, while the massive earthen mounds, intricate city plans, hundreds of kilometers-long trade networks, and sophisticated engineering traces of North America are barely known. And it is precisely within this gap that a question begins to grow. In a continent with such an ancient and rich past, why do we know so little? And were some archaeological discoveries truly hidden? Claims circulating online: the Smithsonian destroyed giant skeletons. Another race lived in America before humanity. History was deliberately narrowed. All feed on this uncertainty. Yet the truth is neither completely innocent nor entirely conspiratorial. Within the scientific world, there is no proven evidence of a vast civilization capable of rewriting human history that was intentionally concealed. But it is also undeniable that America's archaeological past was long misrepresented, that some discoveries were ignored, some findings were not taken seriously, and certain truths were suppressed, or political and cultural reasons, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when American archaeology was shaped by a single question: could complex civilizations really have existed on these lands? Or were the native peoples merely primitive? A mindset in which the European gaze often saw indigenous peoples as incapable of building civilizations, and when faced with the enormous mounds, geometric settlements, and engineering marvels of the Mississippi Valley, concluded the Indians could not have built these. And it is here that the seed of America's hidden history narrative was planted, because a mentality unwilling to attribute these structures to indigenous cultures began linking them instead to a lost white race, visitors from Atlantis, or ancient peoples mentioned in the Bible, and thus sacred sites belonging to native ancestors were excavated, scattered, and destroyed, as if they were remnants of some mysterious forgotten race. Thousands of mounds were flattened to make way for farmland. Human remains taken from them were transported to museums, classified, and often lost without proper documentation. In this process, many artifacts were misinterpreted, set aside for not fitting popular theories, and the objections of indigenous communities were suppressed, and much of what is today described as hidden is in fact the result of that era's scientific arrogance, racist assumptions, and political priorities, which caused discoveries either to vanish or to be distorted. And years later, people began to realize that at one point, some thin GS truly had been ignored, a realization that gradually transformed into the thought, then there must still be much that is hidden today, whereas the reality stands in a far more complex and human place, because history is rarely bent by secret malicious plans, but rather by false beliefs, power relations, the ideology of an era, and the simple fact that science itself is carried out by human hands. The stories lying beneath American soil are therefore both real and shrouded in mist. And within that mist, people imagine sealed chambers, forbidden bones, and erased civilizations. And in this text, we will step into that haze, separating myth from reality to pursue a single question. Were America's archaeological discoveries truly hidden, or were we simply raised on the wrong stories? As this fog thickened over time, certain names and institutions began to take on an almost mythical role in popular imagination, and none became more symbolic than the Smithsonian Institution, which in online lore transformed from a vast research and museum complex into a shadowy guardian of forbidden truths. Accused of collecting and destroying evidence of giants, lost races, and ancient technologies, yet this image did not appear out of nowhere. In the late 19th century, American newspapers were filled with sensational reports describing enormous skeletons unearthed from mounds, skulls too large for any normal human, and graves belonging to a vanished race of giants. Stories written in an era when journalism was driven by spectacle rather than verification, when exaggeration sold pee. Appers and scientific literacy among the public was limited, and when archaeology itself was still a young discipline without standardized methods. So a farmer finding a tall skeleton in a plowed field could easily become proof of a race of giants. Once a reporter embellished the details, and when later professional archaeologists re-examined such finds and classified them as normal human remains distorted by soil pressure, erosion, or myth-making, the public rarely saw those corrections. Only the thrilling first headline remained in memory. And over decades, this pattern created a powerful narrative. Extraordinary claims, followed by quiet scientific retractions that felt like erasure rather than explanation. The Smithsonian did, in fact, collect countless remains and artifacts from across the continent, often through ethically questionable practices, removing bones from indigenous burial sites without consent and storing them in archives for study, a process that today is widely criticized and legally restricted. But in the popular imagination, this became, they took everything away and hid it. And when no giant skeletons were displayed in museum halls, people concluded they must have been destroyed, even though the more mundane truth is that measurements consistently fell within human variation, and early reports were shaped by poor tools, misinterpretation, and a hunger for wonder. Still, the sense of injustice was real, because indigenous voices were silenced for generations, their histories rewritten by outsiders, their sacred sites treated as quarries for data. And when modern laws finally required museums to return remains to descendant communities, the process was framed by some not as ethical repair, but as evidence disappearing, reinforcing the idea that something was being covered up. In this emotional landscape, every gap in knowledge became suspicious, every archive a vault, every correction a lie. And yet, what truly happened is both simpler and more unsettling. Archaeology in America grew within a culture that did not want to see native peoples as builders of complex societies. So evidence that contradicted that belief was bent, delayed, or misread, not through a single coordinated conspiracy, but through thousands of small human choices shaped by prejudice, ambition, and the limits of the era. And when later generations inherited the fragments, the missing pieces looked like intentional absence rather than the scars of a flawed beginning, creating a perfect breeding ground for legends of hidden giants and erased civilizations, legends that feel more satisfying than the quieter truth that history is often distorted not by villains in dark rooms, but by ordinary people who cannot imagine a world different from the one they already believe in. This pattern becomes even clearer when we look at the famous Clovis First model, a theory that dominated American archaeology for most of the 20th century and claimed that the first humans entered the continent around 13,000 years ago, spreading south from a single migration corridor. And for decades, this idea became almost untouchable, not because it was perfect, but because it fit neatly into an orderly narrative scientists were comfortable with. So when scattered evidence emerged, suggesting much earlier human presence tools beneath older geological layers, footprints dating back tens of thousands of years, bones bearing cut marks that implied human activity, many of these findings were dismissed, delayed in publication, or attacked with unusual hostility, not through secret destruction, but through skepticism so intense that young researchers risked their careers by challenging the model. And from the outside, this looked like suppression, as if an invisible wall blocked inconvenient truths. Yet from the inside, it was the inertia of a scientific community built on reputation, authority, and fear of being wrong, where accepting an earlier date for human arrival would mean rewriting textbooks, careers, and identities. Over time, as evidence accumulated and dating methods improved, the wall finally cracked. And today, most scholars accept that humans were in the Americas far earlier than Clovis, proving that what once looked like hidden history was in fact a slow, painful correction process. But to the public, this shift felt like confirmation that something had been concealed all along, strengthening the belief that archaeology guards its secrets rather than revises them. The same dynamic appears in countless smaller cases, where unusual artifacts, anomalous structures, or unexpected dates circulate online as banned discoveries, when in reality, they often sit in academic journals, debated in conferences, buried not by malice but by obscurity, because scientific language does not travel well into popular culture, leaving a vacuum filled by dramatic storytelling. And within that vacuum, every unanswered question becomes proof of intent, every uncertainty a sign of manipulation. What makes America especially fertile ground for these ideas is its violent colonial past, because the land itself remembers dispossession, broken treaties, erased languages, and communities pushed aside. And when people learn that museums once stored tens of thousands of indigenous skeletons in drawers, that sacred objects were cataloged like insects, that entire burial grounds were bulldozed in the name of progress, it becomes emotionally easy to believe that even greater truths must have been hidden, that behind the polite glass of institutions lies a darker archive. And while the scale of that imagined darkness is exaggerated, the wound that feeds it is real, because history in America was not merely misunderstood. It was actively used to justify conquest, portraying native societies as simple, transient, and replaceable. So any evidence of deep antiquity or complexity became inconvenient, not necessarily destroyed, but reframed. minimized, or explained away. The tragedy is that this distortion harmed everyone, stripping indigenous peoples of their legacy while also teaching the broader public to see the continent as empty before colonization. And in that emptiness, myths rush in, offering giants, lost races, and vanished empires as substitutes for the real civilizations that once thrived. So the idea of hidden archaeology is less about bones in basements and more about a collective discomfort with a past that challenges modern identity, because accepting that America was shaped by ancient, sophisticated societies forces a reckoning with what was taken, overwritten, and forgotten, and myths feel safer than responsibility. Beyond the myths of giants and vanished races lies a quieter, far more powerful truth. America's soil holds evidence of civilizations that were not erased by mystery but by history itself. Cultures like the Mississippian world of Cahokia, a city that once rivaled medieval London in population, with towering earth pyramids, astronomical alignments, planned neighborhoods, and trade networks stretching across half a continent. Yet for generations, it was described in textbooks as a large village because the word city felt too bold to apply to indigenous achievement. And this linguistic hesitation reveals more than any conspiracy ever could, because it shows how deeply the narrative of primitiveness was embedded. Even when evidence stood in plain sight, it was made smaller through language, through tone, through omission, and that shrinking of meaning created the illusion of absence, as if nothing truly monumental had ever existed here. So when modern viewers encounter aerial images of immense mound complexes or laser scans revealing hidden urban layouts beneath forests, the discovery feels shocking, almost forbidden, as though something long buried has been uncovered against an unseen will, when in reality it was always there, simply unspoken. This is how hidden history often forms. Not through locked doors, but through neglected sentences. Not through secret fires, but through what is never taught. And the emotional weight of that absence becomes fertile ground for more fantastical explanations, because humans are uncomfortable with emptiness, preferring a story of lost giants to a silence created by centuries of bias. The internet then amplifies this instinct, stitching together old newspaper clippings, misattributed photographs, and decontextualized quotes into persuasive montages that feel like revelations, offering viewers a sense of awakening, of seeing what others refuse to see. And this feeling is powerful because it mirrors the real experience of discovering that history has been unfair, incomplete, and shaped by power. Yet it takes a wrong turn by replacing one distortion with another, trading colonial erasure for mythical substitution. And in doing so, it unintentionally continues the same harm by once again denying indigenous peoples their authorship of their own past, because giants, Atlanteans, and unknown races are just another way of saying not them. True restoration of America's ancient story does not require secret vaults to be opened, but perspectives to be shifted, credit to be returned, and complexity to be accepted, acknowledging that sophisticated societies rose and fell here, adapted to rivers and plains, mapped the sky, engineered landscapes, and passed knowledge across generations long before Europeans arrived, and that the tragedy is not that their bones were hidden, but that their voices were ignored. And in this sense, the real conspiracy is not a cabal of curators, but the lingering shadow of an ideology that once needed these civilizations to be small in order for conquest to feel justified. An ideology whose echoes still shape what feels normal to teach, what seems important to remember, and what can be quietly left out, leaving modern seekers staring into the gaps and imagining monsters where ancestors should stand. Yet even as scholarship changes and new technologies peel back layers of soil and assumption alike, the emotional gravity of hidden archaeology remains, because it speaks not only to facts but to trust, and trust in institutions has been eroded by a long history of exclusion, secrecy, and authority without dialogue. So when people hear that artifacts rest in climate-controlled storage rather than on public display, it feels like concealment rather than curation. And when academic debates unfold behind paywalled journals, they resemble whispered conversations in locked rooms, even though the reality is often mundane, driven by limited space, fragile materials, and the slow rhythm of research. But perception carries its own truth, and for communities whose heritage was once treated as raw material, the line between care and control remains thin. This tension gives every unopened crate a symbolic weight, every unpublished paper an aura of forbidden knowledge. And while there is no evidence of a grand effort to erase a revolutionary past, there is abundant evidence of smaller, systemic failures that together feel like a pattern, such as sites left unfunded, excavations halted by bureaucracy, and histories simplified for classrooms until they lose their depth. And in that flattening, wonder dies and suspicion is born, because a story stripped of richness feels incomplete, and humans instinctively search for what must be missing. Ironically, the modern era is revealing more about America's deep past than any before it, with radiocarbon refinement, DNA analysis, satellite and ground-penetrating radar, uncovering migration routes, trade webs, and urban footprints once invisible. Yet each new discovery also revives the old question, why are we only learning this now? And the answer is rarely sinister, but always human. Because knowledge advances unevenly, because paradigms resist change, because resources follow politics, and because every generation inherits blind spots it does not recognize until they are already behind it. The danger of framing this process as pure concealment is that it turns a living, self-correcting discipline into a villain and replaces curiosity with suspicion, making people feel awakened while quietly closing them off from the very tools that could deepen understanding, whereas the more radical realization is that history is not hidden in vaults, but scattered across landscapes, languages, and memories, waiting not for exposure but for listening, especially to those whose ancestors built what others once refused to see. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is that there is no single curtain to pull back, no forbidden room where everything is revealed at once, only a long corridor of half-lit doors, each opened by patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that the past is more complex than either textbooks or legends have allowed, and that the real work is not uncovering a secret, but learning to live with a history that does not flatter us, because America's ancient story does not need giants to be extraordinary. It only needs us to finally believe the people who were already here. In the end, the question are America's archaeological discoveries hidden? Transforms into something deeper, almost personal, because it forces us to confront how we decide what counts as real, who gets to speak for the past, and why some stories feel easier to believe than others. For it is simpler to imagine secret chambers and burned bones than to accept that entire civilizations were diminished by ordinary prejudice, that their grandeur was quietly edited out of memory, that their absence in our education is not the result of a dramatic plot, but of a long chain of indifference, convenience, and inherited worldview. Conspiracies offer drama and clarity, a villain and a revelation, while reality offers something far more uncomfortable. Responsibility, the knowledge that erasure can happen without anyone lighting a fire, that forgetting can be as powerful as destruction, and that history can be reshaped simply by choosing what to emphasize and what to omit. And this is why the myths persist even as evidence grows, because they give shape to a vague sense of injustice, a feeling that something meaningful has been taken away. And in that feeling, they are emotionally honest, even when factually flawed. Yet there is a quiet hope woven through this story, because the same forces that once narrowed the narrative are now being challenged by new voices, by indigenous scholars reclaiming their past, by technologies that reveal cities beneath forests and footprints beneath ancient mud, by a public increasingly aware that the old version of history was incomplete, and each correction, each rediscovered site, each return name chips away at the illusion of emptiness that once covered the continent, showing that America's ancient past was never truly gone, only waiting for a generation willing to look without inherited blindness. Perhaps the real hidden thing was not bones or artifacts, but respect. And as that respect slowly returns, the land begins to speak more clearly, not in the language of giants and lost races, but in the steady, human voice of cultures that endured, adapted, dreamed, and built, reminding us that mystery does not always mean deception, and that sometimes what feels hidden has simply been standing in plain sight, unseen, because we did not yet know how to recognize it. And yet, even knowing all this, the allure of a forbidden past does not fade easily, because humans are drawn to the idea that reality holds a hidden layer, meant only for those who dare to question. And in a world where so much feels controlled, algorithmic, and opaque, the thought that history itself has been censored offers a strange comfort, a sense that confusion has a source, and that ignorance is imposed rather than accidental. But the deeper and more challenging truth is that the past is not a locked chest waiting for a heroic key. It is a shifting mosaic that changes as we change, and every generation rewrites it, not by conspiracy, but by attention, by choosing which voices to amplify and which to leave unheard. So the real power does not lie in secret archives, but in classrooms, documentaries, museums, and conversations like this one, where the shape of memory is formed. America's archaeological story is still being written, not in hidden rooms, but in open debates, in fieldwork under burning sun, in laboratories decoding ancient DNA, and in communities reconnecting with what was once taken. And the tragedy would be to reduce this living process to a tale of villains and vaults, because that framing steals agency from both the past and the present, turning us into spectators instead of participants. Whereas understanding how myths of concealment arise can free us from them, allowing us to ask better questions, to seek depth rather than shock, and to recognize that the most radical act is not to believe that everything has been hidden, but to insist that what was overlooked be finally seen, named, and honored. For when we replace giants with ancestors, secrecy with context, and suspicion with curiosity, the continent's ancient voice grows clearer, and what emerges is not a scandal, but a story far richer than any conspiracy, a story in which humanity's capacity to build, imagine, and endure is not the exception, but the rule, stretching across rivers and plains, across millennia of quiet brilliance, waiting not for exposure, but for understanding. Looking forward, the way this story evolves will depend less on uncovering dramatic artifacts and more on reshaping how knowledge flows, because the future of American archaeology is not about unearthing a single object that changes everything overnight, but about building bridges between disciplines, institutions, and communities, allowing fragmented truths to reconnect into something whole. And this process is slow, often invisible, lacking the cinematic punch of a forbidden discovery. Yet it is precisely this slowness that gives it integrity. When indigenous elders collaborate with researchers, when oral histories are treated as data rather than folklore, when students learn that cities once rose along rivers long before colonization, a quiet revolution takes place, one that does not feel like revelation, but like recognition. And recognition is harder to monetize, harder to sensationalize, but infinitely more transformative, because it dissolves the need for hidden chambers by filling the room with light. Still, myths will persist, because they serve emotional needs that facts alone cannot satisfy, offering a sense of rebellion against authority, a narrative of awakening in a world saturated with noise. And rather than mocking this impulse, we can understand it as a desire for meaning, for depth, for a past that feels alive. And the task is not to extinguish that fire, but to redirect it toward a truer wonder, one that sees complexity where once there was emptiness, and continuity where once there was rupture. The ancient peoples of America do not need to be giants to inspire awe, because they already shaped landscapes, aligned earth with sky, navigated vast distances without maps, and built social worlds capable of enduring centuries. And when we allow these achievements to stand without mythic substitution, the continent regains its memory, not as a puzzle with missing pieces, but as a tapestry whose threads were always there, waiting to be woven back together. And in that weaving, the question of what was hidden fades, replaced by a more profound realization that history is not something we uncover once and for all, but something we learn to see more clearly, generation by generation, as our own vision changes. There are, however, real cases where material evidence vanished, not through secret agendas, but through neglect, war, development, and the sheer scale of change that swept the continent. Because America industrialized at a brutal speed, railroads cutting through ancient sites, cities rising over burial grounds, rivers dammed and valleys flooded. And in this process, thousands of archaeological locations were destroyed, before anyone recorded them. Mounds leveled for farmland, caves dynamited for stone, artifacts sold as curiosities, and bones scattered by plows. And later, when people learned what had been lost, the absence itself became proof in their minds that something important had been taken away. Early collectors shipped objects overseas. Private museums closed and dispersed their holdings. Small-town archives burned or decayed, and entire collections disappeared into attics or landfills, leaving behind only references in old catalogs. So when modern researchers encounter mentions of artifacts that no longer exist, the gap feels intentional, even when it was simply the product of a world that did not yet value preservation. At the same time, laws once allowed human remains to be treated as specimens, and tens of thousands were removed and stored, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes forgotten in drawers for decades, creating a real, physical distance between communities and their ancestors. And when these remains began to be returned in the late 20th century, the act of reburial was misread by some as evidence being erased, even though it was a restoration of dignity, not a deletion of data. Yet the emotional resonance of "something is being taken away again" fed the narrative of concealment. Add to this the way popular culture thrives on mystery, how documentaries and videos frame uncertainty as suppression, how every unexplained object becomes an out-of-place artifact, and soon the landscape itself feels like a crime scene. Each hill a cover, each archive a vault, even though the true story is scattered across mundane causes, poor record-keeping, shifting priorities, underfunded research, ethical corrections, and the simple fact that archaeology cannot save everything from a changing world. America's hidden past is therefore not hidden behind locked doors, but buried beneath highways, drowned under reservoirs, fragmented across museums, and misunderstood through centuries of bias. And this fragmentation is what gives rise to the feeling of a missing chapter, because people sense that the land once held more stories than they were taught. And in that sense, they are right, not because giants walked here, but because civilizations did, and much of their physical trace was lost before anyone knew how precious it was. Even the cases most often cited as proof of deliberate suppression tend to dissolve into something more ordinary when traced carefully, because many banned artifacts turn out to be misdated objects, misidentified natural formations, or items whose context was lost long ago, making them impossible to interpret reliably. And in archaeology, context is everything. A stone tool without its layer, a bone without its surroundings, a structure without its stratigraphy becomes almost meaningless. So when such items resurface in photographs or auction catalogs, they invite wild conclusions precisely because their story is broken, and broken stories feel secretive. 19th century excavations frequently stripped sites of this context, focusing on collecting rather than understanding. And once removed, an object could no longer testify clearly about its age or purpose, leaving later generations with fragments that seem to whisper of something greater. And when scholars decline to validate those whispers, it is perceived as denial rather than methodological caution. Meanwhile, funding and prestige have always shaped which questions are asked, and research that fits existing frameworks travels faster than work that challenges them. So unconventional hypotheses struggle not because they are forbidden, but because they lack institutional support, and to those outside the system, this feels indistinguishable from censorship, reinforcing the sense that an unseen hand guides what is allowed to be known. Yet if one steps back, the pattern reveals not a hidden empire of secrets, but a discipline wrestling with uncertainty, where claims must survive layers of testing, replication, and critique, and where most ideas fail, not because they are dangerous, but because evidence cannot carry their weight, a slow, frustrating process that rarely satisfies the human craving for revelation. The irony is that America's past is already extraordinary without embellishment, spanning migrations across ice and sea networks that don't link distant valleys, cities built of earth and wood rather than stone, cultures that encoded astronomy and landscape in memory rather than in marble. And it is precisely because these achievements do not resemble old world monuments that they were long underestimated, appearing fragile, temporary, easy to erase, and thus easy to forget. So what feels like a hidden history is often the result of visibility itself, because what does not look like a pyramid is assumed to be less, and what is made of soil rather than stone seems less permanent, even though it shaped lives just as profoundly. America's ancient story was not locked away. It was overwritten by new roads, new myths, and new standards of what civilization is supposed to look like. And the work now is not to expose a secret, but to learn how to read a landscape that speaks in subtler forms, where a low hill may be a temple, a bend in a river, a trade route, and a scattering of shards the echo of a vanished neighborhood, reminding us that history can disappear not because it is hidden, but because we did not yet know how to see it. The giant skeleton stories illustrate this perfectly, because when examined in detail, they rarely survive contact with original sources, measurements, or surviving remains. Yet they persist because they emerged at a time when anthropology itself was tangled with spectacle. When newspapers freely blended rumor with reporting, and when the public was primed to see America's interior as a land of marvels waiting to be revealed. So a tall individual buried in a flexed position could be me, 9 feet long, once the imagination stretched it, and skulls affected by natural deformation or post-mortem pressure could be described as inhuman. And when later scholars quietly corrected these claims, the corrections lacked drama and spread slowly, while the original myth had already taken root. And over decades, the absence of giants in museums was reinterpreted as evidence of destruction rather than the result of normalization, creating a feedback loop in which every lack of confirmation became further proof of concealment. Letters attributed to institutions denying the existence of giants circulate widely, stripped of context, framed as admissions of guilt, even though they often state the simple reality that no verified remains exceed human variation. But in a narrative built on mistrust, denial itself becomes incriminating, and the more carefully scholars speak, the more evasive they seem, while those who claim revelation speak in absolutes that feel honest. This asymmetry of tone fuels belief more than any artifact ever could, because certainty is persuasive and nuance feels like retreat. Yet archaeology is built on nuance. on margins of error, on probabilities rather than proclamations, making it ill-suited to compete with the language of secrets. What appears as hiding is often the collision between a discipline that advances through caution and a public culture that hungers for astonishment. And in that collision, silence is misread as suppression, complexity as evasion, and revision as betrayal, even though revision is the engine of knowledge. America's past becomes a stage where these misunderstandings play out, where every unanswered question is framed as a locked door, even though many of those doors are open to anyone willing to step into the slow, unglamorous corridors of research, where discoveries do not explode but accumulate, and where the truth, far from being forbidden, is simply less cinematic than the legends that surround it. Large federal projects of the 20th century added another layer to this sense of loss, because programs like dam construction across river valleys triggered what archaeologists call salvage archaeology, hurried excavations carried out before entire landscapes were flooded. And although thousands of sites were documented in these rushed efforts, countless others vanished beneath reservoirs with only partial records, leaving behind maps filled with blank spaces where villages, cemeteries, and ceremonial grounds once stood. And for those who later learned that whole valleys of history lay underwater, it felt as though the past had been deliberately submerged, even though the driving force was industrial expansion rather than secrecy. Reports from these projects often remained in technical archives, unread outside specialist circles, so the public saw only the lake, not the cities beneath it. And absence once again bred suspicion, while similar patterns played out in expanding cities, where construction uncovered bones and artifacts that were quickly removed, sometimes by professionals, sometimes by workers who did not know their value. And either way, the context was gone, leaving stories without anchors, perfect fuel for speculation. Museums themselves, with their vast unseen collections, unintentionally reinforce the image of hidden knowledge, because only a fraction of holdings can ever be displayed. So visitors walk through polished halls, unaware that storage rooms behind the walls contain shelves stretching for kilometers. And when people learn this, they imagine secrets rather than logistics, forgetting that preservation requires darkness, stable climate, and time, not exhibition, and that most objects are studied precisely because they are not spectacular. Still, the historical reality that indigenous remains were once stored en masse, cataloged like specimens, and withheld from descendant communities gives moral weight to the idea that something was wrong, and this wrongness easily expands in imagination into a grander wrongdoing. Because when institutions admit past harm, it becomes plausible to believe in deeper offenses, even without evidence. Yet every genuine reform, every repatriation, every collaborative excavation quietly undermines the old narrative, showing that what changes is not what is known, but who is allowed to know it and how it is framed. And as archives open, data becomes public, and indigenous histories are restored to their rightful place. The sense of a sealed past begins to loosen, not through revelation of forbidden artifacts, but through the slow replacement of silence with story, demonstrating that what once felt hidden was often simply unheard. What truly complicates the idea of concealment is that archaeology does not operate like a vault with a single door, but like a vast, uneven terrain where knowledge emerges in fragments, often contradicting itself. And this unevenness is easily mistaken for intent, because humans seek patterns even where none were designed. So when one study overturns another, when a site is reinterpreted decades later, when an early claim quietly disappears from textbooks, it feels like erasure rather than evolution, especially to those outside the field. Yet the history of American archaeology is filled with such reversals, from the dismissal of mound builders as indigenous to their eventual recognition, from the rigidity of Clovis I to its collapse, from the marginalization of oral histories to their growing acceptance as data, and each shift leaves behind a trail of outdated books, museum labels, and popular assumptions, creating a layered confusion where different versions of the past coexist. And in that confusion, people naturally ask which one is true and why the others existed at all. Conspiracy offers a simple answer, while reality offers a difficult one: that knowledge is provisional, shaped by tools, culture, and power, and that what feels like hiding is often the residue of change. The land itself mirrors this process, with rivers altering course, forests reclaiming fields, and earthworks melting back into hills, making ancient cities look like natural terrain, so that even when nothing is intentionally concealed, the past becomes invisible, and invisibility feels deliberate to minds accustomed to walls and locks. Yet America's ancient landscapes teach a different lesson: that history can vanish without malice, that it can fade simply because it is made of soil instead of stone, of memory instead of marble, and that the greatest act of recovery is not breaking into archives, but learning to read subtle traces, to recognize that a gentle rise in a field may be a pyramid, that a scattering of shells may mark a marketplace, that a pat turn in the stars may be mirrored in the ground. And when people encounter these truths, often for the first time, they experience a shock akin to revelation, and this emotional surge easily transforms into the belief that such knowledge was once forbidden, when in fact it was merely neglected. The myth of hidden archaeology thrives because it feels like justice for a long silence, because it dramatizes loss in a way that ordinary neglect cannot. Yet the silence itself has a history, born from colonization, from the desire to see the land as empty, from the convenience of forgetting those who shaped it before. And in this sense, the real secret is not buried artifacts, but buried recognition, the long refusal to see indigenous societies as central to the human story. And until that refusal is fully undone, every rediscovered site will feel like a stolen truth, every correction like an admission, and every unanswered question like a locked door, even though the door was never closed, only overlooked. What makes this subject so enduring is that it sits at the intersection of loss and imagination. Because America truly did lose vast portions of its archaeological record before it was ever understood, and that loss feels too large, too meaningful, to be explained by accident alone. So the mind reaches for intention, for someone to blame, for a hand behind the curtain. Yet the forces that erased so much were diffuse and impersonal. Plows, railways, dams, urban grids, economic urgency, and a worldview that did not recognize indigenous heritage as something worth protecting. And walk on people today stand on a parking lot that once covered a burial ground, or sail over a lake that submerged an entire valley of ancient settlements. The emotional logic of "they must have hidden something" feels more satisfying than "we did not care in time," because the first implies a mystery, the second, a failure, and failure is harder to live with. Early archaeology itself contributed to this wound by treating the past as a resource to extract rather than a story to preserve, removing objects from their landscapes and placing them behind glass, where they became trophies of discovery rather than threads in a living narrative. And this extraction mirrored the broader pattern of colonization, making it natural for later generations to suspect that something deeper had been taken, something beyond what could be seen. And in that suspicion, every rumor finds fertile ground. Every anomaly becomes a key. Every institutional silence, a confession. Yet when the archives are opened, when original field notes are read, when old collections are re-examined, what emerges is not a map of forbidden chambers, but a patchwork of human decisions, some careless, some biased, some well-intentioned, but limited by their time, revealing that the real drama of American archaeology lies not in secret vaults, but in the slow, uneven awakening to what this land truly holds. An awakening that continues even now, as LiDAR reveals cities beneath jungle canopies, as ancient DNA redraws migration paths, as submerged sites along coasts tell of worlds drowned by rising seas. And each of these discoveries feels miraculous, precisely because they arrive after centuries of blindness, making wonder feel like trespass. The narrative of concealment persists because it transforms that belated wonder into rebellion, turning surprise into proof that something was kept from us, when in fact it was time, technology, and perspective that were missing, not permission. And perhaps the most honest way to honor what was lost is not to imagine hidden giants, but to recognize that entire civilizations once flourished here and were allowed to fade into background noise, and that the task now is not to expose a conspiracy, but to refuse silence, to tell these stories fully so that the next generation does not need myths of secrecy to feel that the past is vast, mysterious, and worthy of awe. Within this context, even the language used to describe discoveries becomes charged, because words like anomaly, outlier, or unverified can sound like dismissal to those already primed to expect concealment, while to scientists they are simply markers of uncertainty. And this gap in interpretation widens with every viral clip that frames caution as fear, every montage that pairs an old newspaper headline with a modern denial, suggesting a before and after of truth and erasure, even though the real story is one of refinement, of tools becoming more precise, of standards rising, of imagination giving way to measurement. And it is precisely this loss of romance that feels like theft, because early archaeology promised marvels, while modern archaeology offers margins of error. America's past thus becomes a battleground between wonder and method, where those who crave astonishment see institutions as gatekeepers, and those who guard evidence appear as censors, even though they are bound by the fragile nature of data that can be destroyed by a single misinterpretation. The irony is that many of the claims framed as suppressed are not rejected because they are dangerous, but because they are unverifiable, built on objects divorced from their layers, on photographs without provenance, on stories without sites. And archaeology, unlike myth, cannot stand on narrative alone. It must anchor every claim in place and time. Yet the public rarely sees this scaffolding, only the verdict. And a verdict without visible reasoning feels authoritarian, inviting resistance. This dynamic ensures that the myth of hidden archaeology renews itself with every generation, because it is less about what lies in the ground than about how knowledge feels from the outside: distant, technical, slow. And in that distance, people project intention, imagining that if the truth is not immediate, it must be forbidden. America's landscape, scarred by development and layered with unmarked histories, amplifies this feeling, because absence is visible everywhere, in leveled mounds, in submerged valleys, in artifacts sold long ago, and absence begs explanation. So the story becomes one of vaults and cover-ups, rather than of plows and policies. Yet each genuine breakthrough, each reinterpreted site, quietly rewrites that story, showing that what changes is not access, but awareness, that the past opens not through rebellion, but through patience, and that the real danger is not that something was hidden, but that in believing it was, we overlook the far more unsettling truth that a continent's ancient voices were silenced not by secret orders, but by ordinary neglect, and that restoring them requires not uncovering a forbidden object, but learning to listen where we once refused to hear. Another layer that often feeds the idea of concealment is the gap between popular history and academic reality. Because what enters schoolbooks and documentaries is always a simplified version of what scholars debate, and this delay can last decades. So, when people suddenly encounter information that contradicts what they were taught, such as evidence of pre-Clovis settlements, ancient coastal migra, tie-ins, or complex urban centers in regions once described as empty, they experience it not as progress, but as revelation, as if a curtain has been lifted, and the mind instinctively asks why this was not known before, rarely considering how slowly consensus forms, how long it takes for a new interpretation to replace an old one across thousands of classrooms, publishers, and cultural habits. And this temporal lag feels indistinguishable from suppression to those who encounter the new idea in a single moment online. America's archaeological narrative is therefore haunted by time itself, by the fact that knowledge does not spread at the speed of curiosity, and in that gap, myth thrives, offering immediate answers to questions that science answers gradually. So a LiDAR scan revealing a hidden urban grid in the jungle becomes proof that they lied to us, even though the technology itself did not exist a generation ago, and the lie is only in hindsight. Similar dynamics surround ancient coastal sites now submerged by post-Ice Age sea rise, because their inaccessibility makes them feel deliberately hidden, when in reality they are simply beyond reach, lying beneath waves that erase memory as effectively as any archive fire. And when divers recover tools from the seabed, the discovery feels illicit, like trespass into forbidden history. Even though it is merely an expansion of method, these moments accumulate into a narrative in which America's past appears perpetually, on the verge of breaking free from constraint, as if restrained by an unseen force, when in fact it is constrained, by physics, funding, and the fragility of evidence. And the tragedy is that this framing shifts attention away from the real drama, which is the astonishing resilience of knowledge itself, surviving floods, plows, prejudice, and time, resurfacing in fragments that must be patiently assembled. And the more fragmented that past is, the easier it is to imagine it once existed, whole, in secret, waiting to be restored. Yet what truly existed was not a single hidden truth, but countless lived realities, each leaving traces unevenly, some in stone, others in soil, others only in memory. And these asymmetries produce the illusion of design where there is only chance. America's archaeological record feels conspiratorial because it is incomplete, and incompleteness invites story, but the honest story is that much of what feels hidden was never secured in the first place, never recorded, never protected, slipping away in an era that did not yet know what it was losing. And the work now is not to unmask a hidden order, but to accept that history can vanish without intent, and that recovering it requires humility rather than suspicion, a willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than replace it with myth, because the continent does not withhold its past out of malice. It reveals it slowly, in pieces, asking not for belief in secrets, but for patience in listening. When people speak of forbidden archaeology, what they often respond to is not a specific missing artifact, but a feeling that the official story is too neat for a land so vast and old that a continent capable of holding deserts, rainforests, mountains, and endless plains must also hold histories too complex to fit into a linear narrative. And this intuition is correct. Yet the mistake is to translate complexity into secrecy, because complexity does not require a keeper, only time. And time is what America's past has always demanded more than anything else. The earliest inhabitants did not leave stone cathedrals, but camps that shifted with seasons, paths traced along rivers, marks in bone and shell, stories carried in voice rather than in wall. And these forms of history do not survive conquest as visibly as pyramids do. They fade, scatter, and blend into landscape. So when later societies arrive and build in different materials, the older layers seem to vanish. And vanishing feels intentional in retrospect, even though it is simply the nature of fragile cultures meeting durable ones. The belief that something must have been hidden grows stronger in cultures accustomed to archives, books, and monuments, because absence feels unnatural, as if every civilization must leave behind a library, yet many do not. And those that do can still be erased when power shifts. So America's deep past appears like a story interrupted, pages torn out, not because someone stole them, but because they were written on water, soil, and breath. This mismatch between expectation and reality drives the search for vaults and conspirators, because it is easier to imagine a door than to accept that some stories leave no door behind. And in that sense, the myth of concealment is a mirror of modern values, projecting our reliance on stored knowledge backward onto cultures that preserved meaning in ways we are only beginning to understand. As archaeology slowly learns to read these other languages of the past landscape patterns, genetic echoes, oral tradition, it feels like recovering a lost code. And every successful translation seems miraculous, reinforcing the idea that something once inaccessible has been unlocked. Yet what changes is not permission, but perception, not secrecy, but literacy. And the more fluent we become in these subtler forms, the less the past resembles a locked room, and the more it resembles a conversation we are finally learning how to hear. Specific episodes, often cited as proof of hiding, tend to collapse under close examination. Yet their emotional power remains because they are built around real fractures in the historical record, such as the disappearance of early excavation notes, the loss of private collections, or the destruction of sites before professional study could begin. And when later scholars reference artifacts that no longer exist, or mounds that were leveled a century ago, it creates the impression of deliberate erasure, even though the cause was usually indifference rather than design. 19th century archaeology operated in a world without strict standards, where amateurs dug for curiosity, museums competed for prestige, and objects changed hands without documentation. So provenance was often severed at birth, and once an artifact loses its context, it becomes a riddle, inviting extraordinary interpretations precisely because it can no longer speak clearly. And when institutions refuse to validate such objects, the refusal feels political instead of methodological, as if authority were drawing a line around acceptable reality. This is compounded by the fact that early scholars sometimes did suppress ideas that challenged their worldview, not through secret orders, but through ridicule, gatekeeping, and the power to decide what merited publication. So unconventional claims about early dates or unexpected builders could languish for decades. And when vindication finally arrived, it arrived quietly, leaving behind a sense that truth had been delayed by force rather than by doubt. The bound, airy, between caution and control is subtle, and from the outside it is almost invisible, so people collapse it into intention, reading the slow grind of verification as obstruction. And in a country whose history includes real cover-ups in politics, industry, and war, this interpretation feels natural, even inevitable. Yet archaeology differs in that its raw material resists secrecy, because soil, bone, and stone cannot be commanded, only interpreted, and interpretations shift as tools improve. So what appears to be a pattern of hiding is often a pattern of revision, with each generation correcting the blind spots of the last, and the gaps left behind by those blind spots becoming the stage on which myths perform. America's archaeological record thus feels haunted not by vaults, but by what was never written down, never funded, never protected. And the haunting is real, because absence itself shapes imagination, and where evidence is thin, stories rush in, offering coherence where history offers fracture, turning loss into mystery and mystery into accusation, even though the deeper truth is that a continent's past can be diminished without a single order being given, simply by valuing speed over memory, land over legacy, and progress over patience. What ultimately sustains the belief that something was hidden is the emotional weight of realizing how much was misunderstood, Because when people learn that entire urban centers once thrived, where maps long showed emptiness, that trade routes spanned forests and plains, that astronomical knowledge was embedded in earthworks, I feel as though a veil has been lifted, and that sensation is so powerful, it seeks a cause, a moment of removal, a hand that drew the curtain, even though what actually happened was slower and far less dramatic. Generations were taught within frameworks that could not accommodate indigenous complexity, so that complexity remained invisible, and invisibility feels indistinguishable from concealment. The American narrative of discovery itself reinforced this, portraying the continent as a blank canvas, awaiting civilization, and every schoolbook that began history with colonization quietly implied that nothing of comparable weight came before. So when modern archaeology contradicts this by revealing deep time and dense societies, the correction feels like rebellion against a lie. And rebellion needs an adversary, which becomes the system, the museums, the historians, even though many within those very institutions are the ones doing the correcting. This misalignment between who appears to hold power and who actually drives change turns allies into suspects and revisions into confessions, feeding a cycle in which every update is read as proof that more must still be hidden. Yet the trajectory of American archaeology shows the opposite pattern, a steady widening of what is considered possible, from the acceptance of ancient migrations to the recognition of large-scale urbanism, from the integration of oral tradition to the return of remains, each step expanding rather than contracting the visible past. What makes this expansion feel like exposure is the contrast with what don't came before, because silence magnifies sound, and centuries of neglect make every new finding ring like a secret revealed, even when it is simply the next piece in a long conversation. The land itself collaborates in this illusion because it hides gently, allowing mounds to become hills, post holes to dissolve, coastlines to sink, and when technology finally uncovers these traces, the act feels transgressive, as if entering a forbidden layer. Yet the earth does not forbid. It forgets, and forgetting is not the same as hiding, though it produces the same effect in memory. America's archaeological story is therefore not one of locked doors, but of fading footprints, and the sense of a cover-up arises from encountering those footprints too late, from realizing that so much passed unrecognized, and that recognition itself arrives unevenly, leaving people to discover in a single afternoon what institutions took decades to accept. Compressing time until gradual change looks like sudden reversal, and reversal looks like exposure. In this compression, history feels manipulated, even though it is merely catching up with itself. And the task is to learn to live in that lag without filling it with villains, to accept that a past made of soil and story will always reveal itself in fragments, and that the wonder of America's deep history lies not in what was hidden, but in how much endured long enough to be found at all. There is also a cultural temptation to imagine that knowledge exists in a finished, complete form somewhere, waiting to be unveiled, as if history were a book already written and merely withheld. Yet archaeology does not work this way, because the past is not a static archive, but a puzzle whose pieces are constantly reshaped by erosion, discovery, and interpretation. And America's particular environment amplifies this instability. With its shifting rivers, vast plains, dense forests, and active coasts, continually reworking the surface, erasing signs and scattering traces, so that what survives does so unevenly, producing a record full of silences that beg for narrative. And where narrative enters, intention is often inferred. People imagine that someone must have decided what would be remembered and what would vanish, because modern life is governed by such decisions. Yet much of what disappeared did so before anyone had the power to choose. Lost in an era when preservation was not a value, and the land was treated as endlessly replaceable. And this absence becomes especially haunting when contrasted with regions where stone monuments endured, making America seem like a stage cleared after the play, encouraging the belief that the props were removed on purpose. In reality, many indigenous cultures built with earth, wood, and fiber, materials in harmony with their environment, but vulnerable to time. So their cities returned to landscape rather than standing against it. And this ecological wisdom paradoxically rendered them invisible to later eyes, trained to equate permanence with importance. So when aerial surveys and remote sensing reveal geometric forms beneath forests or fields, it feels like uncovering a buried secret rather than learning to read a different architectural language. The sense of concealment is therefore as much about our expectations as about the past itself, because we were taught to look for history in stone and text, not in soil and memory. And anything that does not match those forms appears absent, and absence invites suspicion. This misalignment explains why America's deep past feels perpetually on the verge of revelation, as if one more discovery will finally expose what was kept from us, when in fact, each discovery simply teaches us how to look differently, expanding the grammar of history rather than opening a vault. And the emotional shift from ignorance to awareness mimics exposure so closely that it is natural to mistake one for the other. The continent thus becomes a canvas for projection, where genuine rediscovery is experienced as liberation from censorship, even though the barrier was not a wall but a lens. And what changes is not access but vision. And in that change, the myth of hidden archaeology finds its power, because it offers a dramatic story for what is in truth a slow re-education, turning the humility of learning into the thrill of unmasking. And in doing so, it both honors and distorts the magnitude of what was overlooked. As we approach the end of this journey, what becomes clear is that the question of whether America's archaeological discoveries were hidden cannot be answered with a simple yes or no, because the reality lives in a gray space, shaped by loss, bias, inertia, and transformation, where some things were indeed ignored, minimized, or mishandled, not through a single secret order, but through systems built on unequal power and narrow imagination, and where far more was simply erased by time, development, and indifference before anyone understood its value. The feeling of concealment grows from the shock of realizing how incomplete the old story was, how much of the continent's ancient life had been flattened into footnotes or omitted entirely. And when modern research reveals deep migrations, Vast trade networks, complex urban centers, and sophisticated environmental knowledge, the correction feels like exposure, as if a veil has been torn away, even though what changed was not permission, but perspective. Myths of hidden giants and erased races flourish in this emotional space because they dramatize absence, giving shape to a loss that otherwise feels abstract. Yet in doing so, they repeat an old injustice by once again denying indigenous peoples ownership of their own achievements, replacing real ancestors with imaginary others, and turning a history of neglect into a fantasy of suppression. The true story is more unsettling and more human, because it shows how easily a civilization's memory can fade without anyone intending it, how a landscape can be stripped of meaning simply by being used, how education can erase by omission, and how institutions can harm even while believing they serve knowledge. And this truth offers no villain to defeat, only habits to change and responsibilities to accept. America's past was not locked away in forbidden rooms. It was scattered across fields, rivers, forests, and shelves, waiting for eyes willing to see it as worthy. And every generation that learns to read it more honestly reopens a chapter that was never truly closed, only left unread. What remains, then, is not the task of exposing a hidden archive, but of learning how to live with a past that is larger than any single narrative, a past that refuses to fit into clean beginnings and heroic endings, because America's deep history is not a secret chamber, but a wide landscape of fragments, some preserved, some lost forever, some only now becoming legible through new tools and new voices. And the discomfort many feel comes from realizing that what was missing from their understanding was not withheld by a shadowy hand, but by habits of thought that once made entire peoples seem peripheral. The idea of concealment persists because it offers emotional clarity in place of historical complexity, turning gradual correction into dramatic revelation and ordinary neglect into intentional erasure. Yet the more closely we look, the more the pattern reveals itself as human rather than conspiratorial, shaped by prejudice, haste, and the fragile nature of evidence, by cities built over mounds, dams built over valleys, and stories built on assumptions that went unchallenged for too long. America's ancient civilizations do not need giants to be extraordinary, because they already transformed landscapes, organized vast regions, encoded knowledge in earth and sky, and sustained worlds that endured for centuries. And the tragedy is not that their bones were hidden, but that their presence was once considered too small to matter. Today, as those presences return to view through archaeology, technology, and the voices of descendant communities, the continent slowly regains its memory, not through scandal, but through recognition. And perhaps that is the most powerful ending of all, that there is no forbidden door to break, no final truth waiting behind glass, only a widening circle of understanding, where each recovered site, each restored name, each corrected story replaces myth with meaning, showing that what felt hidden was never meant to remain so, and that the real work is not uncovering a secret past, but learning to see a human one